Okay, guys, welcome to another edition of Bikes and Beer Teachable Moments. Today we're going to talk about Harley oil leaks, specific to twin cams, but this is generally relevant to Evo engines or to M8 engines, since a lot of the components are very similar. I think we all know that Harleys often leak oil. We joke about it. We say they're marking their territory. But the reality is oil leaks, while they can be funny in some cases, often indicate an underlying issue. And we want to dig into those a little bit real quickly today. Okay? So what we're going to do here is we're going to start by talking about the transmission and the primary and the clutch. And the reason we're going to do that, the reason we'll start there is because most of the oil leaks that you can't quite understand where they're coming from are coming from those areas. I think it's not uncommon, and I think you guys have probably all seen leaks from the rocker box area. This bike is clean, but very often you'll see some oil leakage up here, or you'll see it here in the front of the cylinder or here in the back, and that's the rocker box leak. And then of course you can have drain plug leaks and things like that. But really most of the leaks that people have trouble repairing themselves are going to be from the transmission, primary, and kind of clutch area. So we're going to start here. We'll talk about the transmission. This is the transmission in a twin cam engine. It's basically just a big cartridge of gears. Looks really complex. It isn't really. We'll talk about the transmission at a different time. But what I want to point out to you is the transmission has a main shaft. And this main shaft is the main output shaft that comes out through the main drive gear, runs through the primary like this. So imagine this shaft coming here. It runs through the inner primary chain case, and then you have right here, then you have your clutch hung off the side of it, right? And then your primary chain kind of runs like this to the motor, okay? So if we think about the whole assembly, we start with the transmission, and then we have oil in the transmission, and then we have oil in the primary. We have a drain plug down here, but we have a seal on the back of the primary, and we have several different seals on the transmission, and we also have a seal on the shifter mechanism, which sits inside the transmission case. And these are all places where your bike can leak oil, and depending on where it's leaking and how bad, you can indicate you have a more serious problem. And we'll go into those a little bit more later, okay? But for right now, you have this transmission, and then you have a main drive gear, and that main drive gear goes kind of like this, and it lines up with your output shaft on the counter shaft. So your main drive gear basically provides drive. The sprocket goes right here, that drives the belt, okay? And then around this main drive gear, you have this very big bearing, okay? So a couple of things. First and foremost, you will see on the main drive gear, this is another main drive gear, you can see there's an O-ring here. And the reason there's an O-ring is because this bearing has to go over the main drive gear. You'll see there's actually a groove in the bearing. This is a really beat up bearing, it's very corroded. But you see that groove? This O-ring sits in that groove. And the reason is we don't want oil leaking around the bearing and coming out through the main drive gear. So you have an O-ring here. Then, once the main drive gear, once the main drive gear is pressed into the transmission case, as you can see, we're pressing a bearing in right there. So once the main drive gear is in the transmission case, you have this bearing sitting on top of it like that, and then you have a seal that goes around the bearing. So you have an O-ring here, then you have a seal here, and then I have to kind of take this main drive gear off again so that I can show you, because then there's a third seal which sits inside here, because there are bearings inside the main drive gear. We've removed them on this one. But these bearings inside the main drive gear are what this main shaft glides on. The big bearing here sits here around the main drive gear, and it really supports all of the weight and the force of the clutch and the primary assembly, okay? But there are still these little needle bearings inside here for this to glide on as it spins. And because there has to be a clearance for the bearings to work, there needs to be a seal to keep oil from leaking out. So you have 3 seals just in your transmission to keep transmission oil from coming out and leaking down the side of the transmission between the transmission and the primary. Then we get to the primary. And if we look on the back side of the primary, we have already taken out the seal here, but there is a seal that sits on the back side of the primary like this. And there's a primary bearing here, okay? That's a carrier bearing. Again, it's just, there's a race that goes on here. I think you saw me talk about the races before, but there's this race that goes on here, gets pressed on, and that race actually rides inside this seal like that. And that goes through the primary, and then all of that crap comes out, and it goes through your clutch. You can see the splines here on the clutch hub, and the splines here, so you can imagine where that goes. And then the chain on the clutch runs forward, and it goes around the motor sprocket here. So your primary assembly runs a chain from the motor sprocket. This is where your compensator would be. It comes back around the clutch basket, and then all of the force that the engine's generating goes through the clutch basket, through these little splines in the clutch hub, and then it goes into the transmission like that. And around here, where your main drive gear is the sprocket or the pulley with the belt that goes to the back of the bike. So again, we have 3 seals just in the main drive gear area. We have a seal here in the inner primary chain case. And then we have a final seal here. This is the shifter pawl. So when you click your shift lever, this thing moves forward or it moves backwards. And what that does is that engages the shift drum, and it pulls the shift drum this way, or it pushes it that way. And what that does is that moves your shift forks, and it changes gear on the bike. But again, this is another place where you have a hole in the transmission case where oil can get out. So this has a bushing that goes around it, and then it has a seal that seals oil from leaking out of the transmission. So again, that's 5 seals and a number of different bearings, but 5 seals between the transmission, the primary, and the transmission case that can all leak oil. And depending on how much oil is leaking and where it's leaking from, it can indicate a more serious problem in your transmission or in your clutch hub or various other things. And we'll talk about that later, but I just wanted to make sure you have a quick understanding of the number of seals and O-rings that actually sit here just within the transmission and primary that are all places that can leak oil on your Harley Davidson. And these things are important to inspect at times and really to replace at intervals to make sure that the bike continues to perform and is reliable. Hopefully this was a good teachable moment for you guys, and for people who don't have a great understanding of how Harley Davidsons work, this should make it a little bit easier for you. We are Bikes and Beer Garage. Reach out to us, talk to us anytime. We are always happy to speak with you, and we're always very happy to work on your bike and make sure that it is as strong and reliable as you want it to be. Cheers. Teachable moment, Bikes and Beer Garage.